battery at each minute, and then say longer is 15 and I somehow imagine based on, as well as when I see active gear, like the battery performance.
Yeah. She wasn't really good.
I mean, it was under like a year. That's
well, it's really like the time
That's
you
definitely
do
the
it,
case.
it has more to do with the power cycle, the charge discharge cycle. You drain it all the way down, you know, and then charge it all the way back up. It's not long enough to let it go on. Yeah.
And usually plug it overnight. Like I never really know that. I love their battery. It's like with a
How's this warming up?
I don't think so.
sounds like it could be ribs.
I just read a PowerPoint book.
What should I call it? SAS. SAS is a good option.
Is that what we're talking about?
Just talking, not no real actual meaning behind what I'm saying. That's usually the case. I'm just like this. Occasionally buzz terms come out. Jargon. Why does it actually know anything?
Oh, that's what it is.
Story of my life.
That's in
Wichita, Kansas?
yes, those places.
That seems bad.
The scaling PhD to 40 or 60 million units. Talk history. It was pretty good. There were some good stuff there. I think probably my favorite bit was the scaling on the boiler. It's like a joke framework. HTML boiler strap JS. So yeah. So have you seen this? Okay.
I've heard of each of the components of that though.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll find there's an actual page where it's like it's the cross-functional, jargon filled, blah blah blah. Universe, yeah, it's fully universe compatible.
HTML9 strap.
Boiler strap.
Mhm.
Boiler strap. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that stuff does everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Shave your tape.
It's universe compatible.
Responsive borders.
Flexible, dependency-free, lightweight, device-agnostic, modular, baked-in component framework, NBC library, shoelace strap to help you kickstart your responsive CSS-based app architecture backbone kitchen sink breaks.
.js.
.js.
Brilliant.
H9 RBS.
With video. Spoken or herbs.
Herbs, that's right.
You can download it too. It's an actual
It's actually big.
it's like an index file and a.
This is working
and a
Commodore 64.
Yeah.
Caveman extended fingernails. Those are 2 points.
Still never know.
This was not
Yeah,
all
it is.
compiled
Trying to
to
get
plus
this in.
19 or just being shared Java.
No gem.
You can mirror the displays.
Yeah, we gotta do too.
Sounds like he would have written.
You should forward that.
I can show the lights out.
Yeah, I don't need the presentation.
You mean stretched, you mean? You don't like it stretched? You press the button again?
No, I just didn't export properly. I use Open Office, so exporting a PPT just did not go well. So. You know what? Forget it. We don't need a presentation. I can just
I've
talk.
been at tomorrow.
All right.
CC.
Ah. All right. Well, hello. Sorry for the technical issues. I work almost exclusively in Linux and did not like the export to Microsoft PowerPoint. All the formatting got lost. So I guess I just want to start off, tell a very short story. So, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I want to welcome Bryan Healey to our conference. His first time speaker at our conference. He went to Northeastern University, worked on artificial intelligence. He works at a company called Main Media.
Yeah.
And he's going to tell us how to find and keep, maybe, good engineers. So, give a listen.
Sure. So I'll start off by just telling a very short story. So several years ago, I was applying for a senior engineering position at a very young startup. And I was going to be the second technologist and the sixth employee, so very early on. Scheduled an early morning interview. They called me about 18 minutes late, and after about 20 seconds of very easy pleasantries like hello and how's your morning, I was asked very quickly, so tell me, how many ping pong balls fit inside an airplane? Anyone who's worked in technology probably has heard this question since then. It became kind of popular amongst companies doing hiring, but I'd never heard it before. So after a moment of confusion, I immediately started asking a lot of follow-up questions. You know, how big's the airplane? How big are the ping pong balls? Do I need to worry about packaging them? Is this more of a theoretical thought condition, or do I have to shove them through the front door? And does this include the cargo hold? And just wanting to get more information so that as an engineer, I can nail down an algorithm and actually figure out the size. And to every question I got very frustrating answers. I got answers like the standard size of a 747, or the standard size of a ping pong ball, or maybe, or either, or other very vague answers. And as an engineer, I found that very frustrating. You know, I want to find variables to problems and plug them into an equation and get an answer. So that they were trying to hire an engineer, it seemed odd to me that they would ask a question this way, and I've since learned that I think I know what they were trying to do, which is just get a basic idea of how I think. But the question I pose is, do you think that helps them at all? And my argument is that kind of, but not enough. Since then, I've gone on to be a technical lead. I've done my own hiring. I've worked for a couple of other startups. And I've come to realize that the reason why a lot of hiring is weird and different and complex is because hiring is probably the biggest challenge a manager faces. Not because it's particularly difficult, but just because of how big of an impact it can have, especially in a startup where money is tight and you need the best people you can get for as cheaply as you can get them. And, you know, I mean, it's a really good engineer can change the dynamic of a team. I mean, anybody who's worked with that kind of a really senior talent can see that. You know, they take charge, they'll be mentors, they'll really help young engineers, they'll, you know, open up the process. And at the same time, somebody who's not a good fit for a team, even if it's not the fault of the hiree, they're just not at the right stage of life. Somebody who's worked for, you know, a Fortune 500 company their whole lives is going to have a different experience working for a startup and vice versa. They will potentially very damage a team. You know, if somebody who's very used to really rigid processes comes into a startup with 3 people, they might have a difficult time adapting to, you know, 100-hour weeks and insane release schedules. So it's really important, I feel, especially in a startup, to be really cautious about how you hire and try to really flesh out how good of an engineer somebody is. And in my opinion, in my experience, very few companies do a good job at this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think a lot of companies do wrong and what I think a lot of companies should do. And I want to preface the whole talk by saying that a lot of hiring, much like a lot of engineering in general, is very subjective. This is just my opinion and my experience, and I welcome people to challenge me on them. But this is just what I've found. So first, I just want to talk about a couple of things I think companies don't do correctly. The first one that worries me when people hiring is any company that immediately engages in trying to find out how good you are at memorizing things. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this, but you get on a call and you just get a litany of questions over a half an hour that are, how many, you know, tell me how to write a regular expression to strip out numbers out of a string, tell me how to animate things in jQuery. It's just very specific, very focused questions that are technology specific. And all that's really determining is either A, how quickly you can Google if you're on the phone and sitting at a computer, or B, how well you have memorized things, which and it bothers me mostly because people who do the hiring should know that it's an unwritten rule in the industry that you don't memorize really specific things. We have the internet now. It makes it really easy to find solutions to common problems. And any good engineer, when they find a solution to a problem that isn't common, will quickly comment about it, they'll blog about it, they'll write about it, and it becomes available. You know, especially with the time constraints most engineers have, you don't want to have to memorize everything or look everything up in a book. You be resourceful, you look up code, you use open source software that's available. You know, you have to work quickly, and memorizing a lot of various things is just not going to help you get there. You know, a common quote that's attributed to about 20 famous people, so I'm not even going to bother saying one, but I like the sentiment is, don't commit to memory anything that can be looked up in a book. And I think that that sentiment should be extended to the internet. Anything you can quickly find in 2 seconds on a Google search should help you. Which, by the way, for the record, if you Google how many ping pong balls fit inside an airplane, is the first result on Boeing's website, and it's 19 million.
Was that without the seats?
Apparently it's without the seats. That's the entire cargo hold, the entire hull. Number 2, and this kind of harkens back to my original example company, is try not to have engineers solve logic puzzles without boundaries. You know, I get why logic puzzles exist. Like I said, they're trying to figure out how you think. They want to get you to break down solving problems. But if you don't actually let them attempt to solve the problem, all you're doing is giving them a situation that pretty much anybody can do. Anybody can take a problem and try to say, well, I need to know how much room there is, and I need to know how big the object is, and it's much more valuable, I find, to have real answers to questions they give and let them give an attempt at solving the problem. If you're going to ask the Boeing question, tell them how big the plane is, tell them how big the ping pong balls are, and let them start to formulate an algorithm in their minds and explain their way through the process. Even if they can't give you the right answer, it gives you a better indication of how they would get to the right answer than just more vague, like, oh, I'd find out how big a ping pong ball is and then start stuffing them in the plane until I get full. Number 3, and this one I feel is very important, but also polarizing, stop worrying so much about college degrees. And I want to emphasize the word so much because I'm not saying that education is useless. I actually think it's very useful. I'm very happy with my Northeastern education. I think it did make me a better engineer. But the problem I have is a lot of the industry, more so on the bigger company side, the startups are a little bit more flexible, I find, but it becomes a very binary position. Either you have the requisite degree in education or you won't even look at your resume. I mean, I've personally submitted resumes to companies where I thought I even met their education requirements, and there was a little thing at the end saying master's preferred, and never even got a phone call. And when I would follow up, it was, oh, you didn't have the right education requirements. And this worries me because some of the best engineers I've ever worked with didn't even go to college. You know, they immediately out of high school, got a technical certification, and started working for their uncle's computer shop and just worked their way through. And some of the worst I've ever worked with had PhDs and resumes a mile long, and they just don't fit into a high dynamic startup culture, and you know, they just wanted to write math algorithms their lives. And so just immediately discounting people for not having education that you think is valuable as a hiring manager, I think makes a lot of companies miss a lot of talented engineers who would be able to make pretty substantial contributions. You know, and college is an interesting thing. I think it's valuable to have gone. I'm proud of the experience, but it mostly teaches you how to work under pressure. I don't know how many of you went to college or how many of you share this experience. Most of the knowledge I have used practically, I learned before college or on the job. College taught me O notation, it taught me how to write proper algorithms, but they didn't teach me PHP doc. They didn't teach me how to develop good design principles in the front end. There's a lot of things that just get taught in the fires of working, and anyone that has good critical thinking skills can learn that. So it's not that you discount uneducated people, just give everyone a fair shake and focus more on what they've accomplished and where you think they can go by talking to them. And number 4, this one I kind of throw in it's not as important, I think, as the other three, but I see it so often that I feel like commenting on it, is don't subject candidates to marathon interviews. I've done interviews that are like 5-6 hours long, and you just get a string of 6-7 people over and over and over again that ask you, first of all, the same 15 to 20 questions that you're really not even talking anymore. You're in robot mode, just regurgitating the same thing over and over again. And you're not really offering any real value as a candidate that shows them what you can do. You're just basically trying to convince every person that walks in there for 20 minutes that you are not stupid. And by the same token, don't go the opposite direction where you don't learn anything about the person technically, and they hold like evening social parties. I've seen these sort of group interviews where you just have cocktails and food and everyone just hangs out, because then you have the exact opposite problem. You're not asking them any questions. It becomes a very untechnical experience. You're just learning how good they can socialize, and that doesn't really help you either. So now that I talked about things that I think companies do wrong, I want to talk about a couple things that companies don't do enough, or hiring managers don't do enough, and that they should do. Number one, and this one's kind of an odd one, but I've gone through about 20 to 25 interviews in my life, and I see this very consistently, is hiring managers really need to work on being more conversational. A lot of interviews come across almost just like Q&As. They ask a question, you give an answer, there's no follow-up, there's no personalization. It makes the candidate uncomfortable, and if the candidate's uncomfortable, they're not going to show you what they're really like. They're not going to be open up and honest. And it makes the interviewer not really get a good grasp of who they are. And the whole experience is trying to figure out whether or not they'd be a good fit in your team. And more importantly, I feel, is when you make the candidate uncomfortable in an interview, a lot of people lose out on the fact that you're trying to convince them to work for you as much as you're trying to figure out if they're a good candidate. Because the quality candidates, really good engineers, they're going to have options. I mean, they're not the kind of individuals who are going to struggle for jobs. This isn't an unskilled laborer position. You want them to want to work for you. You want them to be excited about it. You want them to think that you're a great fit. That's the company that for me. So make them feel comfortable. Ask them more personal questions. Be more conversational. Let it flow. Don't have a script when you go in there. Have a starting point and then let the conversation move wherever it needs to move to. And related to this, too often the interviewer dominates the conversation. They talk too much about the company. They talk too much about their own experience. I find it much more valuable to ask open-ended questions and let the candidate just talk, just go on. The most important question I find is why. Always ask people, like, why did you choose that direction? Why did you break down the project in that way? Why did you choose that technology for that project? Because you learn a lot about somebody by how they talk about what they do and the reasons they give. You find out what they're passionate about. If somebody was working for a Python shop and you find out why did you had to develop this algorithm for replicating databases, you used Perl, why'd you use that? You might find that they have a passion for Perl, they have a passion for scripting languages, and so just learn about the candidate by letting them tell you all on their own. Number two, and this one I feel is the most important, is to make engineers write code. When you get down to it, you strip away all the pretense. Engineers solve problems in code. That's what they do. Everybody has different ways of solving problems. A CFO is going to solve problems with money and accounting, and a CEO is going to solve problems with personal skills and networking. Engineers solve problems with code. So if you're going to hire an engineer, you've got to know how they code. And I think a lot of companies get this, but the approach that they take that I see a lot is things like writing on whiteboards or writing code with somebody standing behind them and looking at the screen, which just makes people uncomfortable. I believe that you need to let people write code in their own element. Send them home, give them a real problem, something that is not some silly recursive function that came out of a 1994 textbook. Make it a real problem. Even consider paying them a small contract fee for like 2 weeks of work or 1 week of work or even just 2 days of work, but something that's real that will produce original code, and then let them go home. Let them work on their own computer, with their own keyboards, on their own IDE, without somebody standing behind them looking at them. And the only structure that they should be given is a deadline and the understanding that they can ask questions anytime that they have them. Because this is exactly how they're going to work if they work for you. Engineers don't get micromanaged. That's the whole basis of the job, is we're creative problem solvers, we're intelligent engineers. We're often given guidelines and then off to our own, and then we have a deliverable date. That's when we need to present our work. And then scrutinize the work and just see what kind of code they produce. And don't worry about what I call cheating. I've actually heard that a lot. I've worked for a company where I was trying to espouse this exact principle, and well, we can't let them do that. They'll find the answer online. I think that's great. That shows a resourceful engineer that knows exactly. That shows an engineer who gets that you don't recreate work that's already been done by 10 other people. And
But then you have to have the follow-up question.
exactly.
Did you write this or did you find this?
Exactly.
Then you have to present that in such a way that it doesn't sound biased toward one or the other.
Exactly. Just get them to explain why they did what they did, how they got there. You learn a lot about an engineer that way. I mean, it shows a lot about what they think is good practice. Number 3, don't worry about references. So many companies ask for like 5 references. And the way I look at references is they may be valuable in that if you get references and they're bad references, you at least eliminated an idiot from the pool, because references are candidate given. You're providing your own references. If you can't find 5 people to give you a good reference, then that's obviously an indication of a problem. But most of your candidates aren't going to have that problem. People are going to be able to come up with references. They're always going to be positive. They're not going to give you much genuine feedback. The only references that are valuable for an engineer, and I find this especially in the web world, is their portfolio. Web engineers especially are a lot like artists. The things they create, they love to show off. I mean, I still talk about websites I made 10 years ago, and I'm all proud of that. Oh, that's still held up against the changes of standards, I'm proud of that. And people like to talk about it. I'm willing to show code. Look at what they've done. Look at where they've gone.
But besides what they've accomplished, would you not like to know how they work in a team, what's their attitude? You can inquire about these things.
Yeah.
And if the person who receives the call doesn't necessarily expect that question, they will eventually tell you the truth.
That's very possible. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't collect references. If you feel that you can do both, that's great. And just in my experience, though, I've found them not ultra valuable because they always seem to give positive responses to every question I ask. I've never been able to get a reference to get caught off guard by a question and say, oh yeah, they don't do that very well, or I've never been able to get real world negatives, because I want those negatives, not because to discount them, because everyone has weaknesses. Everyone has something they're not that great at, and it's good to know that going into a hiring process, and you can put them where they best fit. If somebody's not a good manager or good people skills, you don't want to make them a team lead over 5-6 people, because they're just going to be uncomfortable. They're not going to produce their best work. I want people to be where they are best fit. And references never give negatives, because they're usually close colleagues or friends or people that they've worked with for years, and they want to see these people succeed. So every answer is going to be really positive. So I think that they're valuable in that, yes, you're right, you can maybe get people to give slightly more structured feedback. I just find, in my experience, that it's never negative. They'll find a way to spin it and make it sound positive.
But rather than asking for positive or negative, maybe you can give them a choice and see towards which they lean, so that they
Yeah.
give you information.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I agree that if you are good at getting, you might be better at getting feedback out of people than I am. Maybe people just don't respond well to my questions. And I think that if you do, that's great. I mean, because you're right. If you can get them to be honest, the best source of information is going to be colleagues. If you can get them to tell you how they really are, they know. They've worked with them. They've had experience with them.
Yeah, I was going to say one way I phrased that question was, what's a skill they need to work on?
That's true, and there's really very few ways to get out of that without.
Right, and I've had that same experience. Oh, they're great, they're perfect, they're wonderful, and they're like, what skill do they need to work on? Oh, well,
Right.
they're not so good with deadlines. It was good feedback. It was
That's a
really
very good question. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. It's a very good question. I like that. I guess the final point I wanted to make is don't be afraid to let someone go. I've worked, this is a very common problem in startups. Big companies don't have this problem. But in startups, I find that a lot of times people will get resumes of superstars, people who have giant, long resumes, deep experience, they've worked with everything, but they're just not the right fit. None of the engineers really get along with them. There's just issues. And the hiring manager, who's in this situation in startups, usually like the CEO or one of the founders, they don't want to let them go because of how talented they are. They see it as, well, this is a star. I need to bring them in. They'll wrangle the team together. And in my experience, that doesn't work very well. If if you're clearly not a good fit and you bring them in anyway, that's going to make the engineer either bored or ornery because they're going to want to make the process fit to what they're comfortable with. It's going to break up the team dynamic a little bit, and oftentimes I found it makes the engineer leave. After about 6 to 8 months, they find something else because this is a person who's very talented in their own right. They have a lot of experience, and somebody else is going to snap them up who's a better fit. And you're just left with 6 to 8 months of discomfort with the team dynamic, and people are now unhappy because they were usurped by another engineer. But the exact same token though, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, don't discount anyone. There are examples of companies like IBM and Microsoft that probably get 1,000 resumes a month, and they obviously can't call everyone. They need to use some judgment and be judicial. But in a startup, that's very rarely the common. I've never worked for a startup, even really like big startups that have been in the news a lot, that got more than like 50 resumes a month. Call everyone. Even if the resume is really small and doesn't show experience, you can be amazed how much just a 5-10 minute phone call can tell you about somebody. You know, it shows you how passionate they are, how interested they are, what kind of questions they ask. And you might find somebody in the very early stages of their career who's intelligent and devoted and passionate and going to be an excellent engineer, but they just haven't proven themselves yet. And even though they don't fit into your job description exactly, you were looking for someone mid-level, at least bring them in to talk if they seem like they could be a good fit and they just don't quite have the experience. Because a lot of the most devoted and productive engineers I've worked with were people fresh out of college that really want to prove themselves. They know they have the talent and they just want to get in somewhere and show off. So call everyone, give everyone a shot, even if it's worst case scenario, you waste 5 minutes a couple of times a day. And then on a related note to similar, don't look for the perfect candidate because the tech titans, the really impressive people, are rare and they're very expensive. And if you're a startup, you probably don't have that, you probably don't have the ability to make that work. Just look for somebody who's going to be a good fit. Build out a team of people who care, who are passionate, who understand the technology, and be willing to shuffle around a little bit. You know, if you're looking for a mid-level engineer and you find somebody very junior, give them a shot. Even senior, if you're looking for somebody to lead a team and you find somebody fresh out of college but they wow you, you bring them in and they're engaged, they have good leadership talents, you know, give them a shot. In the worst case scenario, you can replace them, which is unfortunate, but it at least opens you up to the possibility of finding somebody who could be a great fit but doesn't exactly match the resume. So, I mean, that's kind of what I have. It's just my experience. I find that a lot of companies try too hard to pigeonhole people into very simple hiring processes, getting answers on knowledge or specific technologies, and not focusing enough on, you know, the specific person. I find engineering to be a very unusual field. It's not completely unique. A lot of knowledge-based fields are like that, but in engineering, we're very diverse creatures. I mean, we tend to be managers on a micro level. We're problem solvers. We're usually given very loose guidelines, and we're expected to solve problems and be really creative. And it's hard to find somebody who can very well fit that role. And so I think it just needs a lot more attention to detail. My biggest pet peeve is when I go into a company and find that they don't really care that much about hiring. You know, I've worked for managers who are just kind of like, oh, I have to talk to somebody. And you know, if you hire a really good team as a manager, it's going to be the greatest thing you ever do, because a really good team will work very well independently. They won't give you much stress. They'll meet their deadlines. They'll produce quality code. And so just get it right on the first end, and you'll make your life so much easier at the other end. Any questions? Thoughts? Hate mail.
Just one thing about the degree thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you hire out of country and you want to bring them in, then a degree is super important for getting them an H-1B or a green card.
What's that? Sorry.
If you hire out of country and you want to bring them to the U.S.,
Yep.
then the H-1B process is totally like affected by whether or not they have a degree.
Ah, that's very true. Yeah, that's a very good point.
We have a degree requirement as a requirement, even though I prefer not to necessarily do that, because we have to have that bar for out of country.
No, you're very right. Yeah, there's definitely different considerations when you're hiring on a very diverse range. And I mean, that kind of brings to a related point as candidates, not as a hiring manager, but as somebody who's looking for work. I always recommend people apply to positions that look like they're out of your league. Just throw your resume out there, because, like you say, a lot of those requirements aren't necessarily for everyone. It's just kind of, they're trying to narrow the field a little bit. So if they're saying we need a minimum 5 years experience and you've got 3 or 4, the worst thing that will happen by putting your resume in is they don't call you. So I always say, give it a shot. You might be surprised what you find.
I'd like to hear your opinion about on my next question, but I'd also like to see if there's anyone else who's had any experience using sites and responses and stuff that people have posted to sites like Stack Overflow. If you've looked at candidates who or received a candidate and then look for stuff that they've posted to Stack Overflow.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Or GitHub.
Yeah, that comes back to my portfolio. That's what I consider kind of their portfolio. I find really good engineers like to show off their work. They have GitHub accounts, they have personal websites that they play with, and they show off new technologies. So I always, as soon as I know somebody's coming in for an interview, one of the first things I do is scour around and just see what they've done, where they've worked, their LinkedIn profile, what are they proud of, what do they want to show off. It tells you a lot about what they care about. If they're supposed to be a broad front-end engineer, you look in the profile and you find 45 GitHub projects that are all JavaScript libraries. That tells you something. They like to work in the front end. They like building out front-end tools that are going to improve the presentation. And that can help you guide the interview and tell you a lot about where they'd be a good fit.
I'm here from another country, and this is the other side of this LinkedIn profiles and social networking, is that people prefer to spend the working hours for responding to Stack Overflow questions and posting their libraries for GitHub instead of working right for the project. So we found the problem of 5 senior engineers spending more than half of their working time writing libraries, and this is not so good. They are great start, but they're not good workers.
Well, I have kind of a funny. It's funny that you mentioned that. I actually have kind of a middle. In a lot of the places I've worked, I find a lot of managers put a little too much focus on day-to-day. The most important thing to me is the delivery date. If I need something at the end of a 2-week sprint and it's part of the release cycle, as long as you can deliver that to me and it's quality, it's not bug-ridden, it's ready to be, it can go through a quick QA cycle and get released. I don't care if you work 2 hours that week. You gave me what I needed. You gave me the project that, it might adjust how I schedule you the following week, but I find really good engineers need break times during the day. They need to kind of tool around. It's a very thought-based profession. We're doing a lot of mental work, and doing that for 8 straight hours is not usually going to happen, even if you try.
All of my people are working remotely. We're sort of, virtualized
Right.
everywhere. And so if I'm up at 1 o'clock and I see an email, I get an answer from an email from a developer, I know that he's probably going to be up until 5 o'clock in the morning. So then
Right.
I know I'm not even going to try to get an answer out of this guy before noon on the next day, because I've sort of figured out his work cycle, and that's fine because he gets things done. Joel on software says you need 2 requirements: the guy is smart and they get things done.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. As long as I can rely on them to get me code when I need it. If there's a project crunch, I know if I give them this work, they'll get it done, and they'll get it done however they need to get it done. And sometimes that means working late, sleeping in late, working through lunch, or just taking 2 hours in the middle of the day to go play ping pong ball. As long as the work gets done. And related to what you said, I find, like I was talking about, engineers like to show off. It just seems to be kind of the nature of what we do. It's a very almost artistic medium. We're creating interesting solutions to problems almost with words. It's almost linguistic. It's like writing, literature. And so I always try to encourage people, when they write interesting libraries for the project, open source that. Maybe that's worth showing off, and it becomes almost part of what they do. And I find that it actually tightens up the code they write for the company, because they're going to open source this when it's done. They want to create a quality project, and they want it to be something that they feel worth showing the world instead of something that they'd rather hide.
There's a problem with that. The problem with that is it often changes the scope of what it is.
That is true.
Building the little.
That is true. Yeah, you do. It's like anything else. It requires a little bit of intuition about the engineer and what they're going to do. Obviously, I've worked with people who you can't let off the hook, because they'll go too far to the left, and So yeah, there's a little bit of intuition there. You had your hand up, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
For a while.
thanks for a while. So regarding, open sourcing to GitHub and Stack Overflow, some people are actually really awesome, but they tend to keep to themselves.
Yep.
I've known people who've done amazing work and I've never heard of them. They don't have a blog. They don't even have as much as a LinkedIn profile.
Yep.
So yes, of course, it's our nature to show off, but some people are just out of character. But they still get a lot of stuff done and they're really very skilled.
Yep.
And on the other hand, some people open source a lot of things, but if you just look through the code, you see it's all just
right.
bullshit, right? So you have to be really careful and not just look at the volume. If there's absence of Stack Overflow answers or questions, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person is not good. But if you do find anything, then you have to really dig deep and see if it's just fluff or.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's kind of goes back to what I say. First of all, don't discount anyone, even if they don't look like what you want. You never know. I mean, some people, like you said, are quiet. I mean, they keep to themselves, but they're amazing engineers, and you should at least let them write some code for you, let them show what they can do, and get a good feeling for them. And you're totally right. If you do find a portfolio, actually look at it. Don't just be like, oh, look at their GitHub profile. They have 48 followers. That's wonderful. Read some of the code. Show it. And if you're not a great engineer, some hiring managers aren't engineers themselves. Have your team look at it. That's what they're there for. Really get a feel for what they can do. Any other thoughts?
I'd say always be a talent scout. Get your team involved in the interview process so that when they get hired, if they get hired, there's a team there that actually wants to see this person succeed. Send them to conferences so that they can speak about the people they meet here.
Yeah.
Just involve your whole team in the talent scouting. That's kind of what I call it. It's hard enough finding the people.
Yeah.
Getting them there with a resume is just half the work. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you, about finding people that you want to work with as well. In a 40-hour week, which I find is pretty much the minimum in engineering, nobody works less than that. That's 23.8% of your week, including weekends and nights when you're sleeping. So make sure that you like the people you're going to work with, especially in a small company where you're going to work with them a lot and in close proximity. So it's not just about finding out how great technically they are, although that's the most important thing, that's the base, but also get a feel for them. That's why you let your engineers all talk to them. Have everybody interact, so that you can at least understand if they're going to be a good culture fit.
And I would remember that you're spending time with these engineers during your day. Sometimes you spend as much, if not more, time with these people during the quality part of the day than your own family.
Yeah,
so make sure you
true.
like the people you work with. Make sure it's a good fit.
Yep, and I'm sure everybody. A lot of people have worked for startups where you're in the office like 70 hours a week. You got to make sure that you're comfortable with the people you work with, at least at the basic level. They don't need to be your best friends. But they need to at least. You need to at least be okay with them. Be able to get along, have conversations, be open.
I find, as a hiring manager myself, that I'm more interested in the characteristics of the people that I'm hiring to match the group that I'll be working with.
Yeah.
And I'm not so much concerned with the technical skills of the person. They got the hooks, come in and say that the best thing on the planet technically in a particular area, and it's not the area I'm necessarily interested in, but they have the other characteristics that would fit well with the team.
Yeah.
I'll take them over the guy who was brilliant, but really tough to deal with.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. The odd thing about programming is it's a lot like learning a lot of different Romance languages. Like French, English. They're different, but there's a lot of similarities. And if you are really skilled at one and you have good critical thinking skills, you probably can very quickly learn another. Some of the best engineers I've hired were Python developers. And it's a PHP shop. It's like, oh, well, it's great. They can easily fit in. They get the principles of OO. They get, they are equipped to fit. So yeah, you're totally right. I like that.
So what do you do in a situation like this? I'm actually hiring, and right now I'm looking for one person, and we have this list of has to be able to do all of these things. And it's like 5, and I'm thinking, can we pick 3?
Right.
Because if I can have a person who can do 3 of those things, I'm convinced they can learn the other 2. And if we prioritize which skills are more important in these requirements, and I'm having a really hard time with my superiors convincing that the perfect fit just isn't out there.
Right.
So what do you do?
Yeah, I've had that exact problem when you end up going through a hiring process that lasts months because you're just way too strict. You're discounting people that you should be seriously considering, and so you know your resumes go from 50 a month, 20 a month, 10 a month, and you know you're going on 3-4 months, and you have to finally go, look, we need to find the right fit, not the perfect candidate.
Easy one. This is, you know, one of the requirements they have to know would be, you know, OAuth for Twitter, Facebook, and G+ and all that. So
Right.
nobody has to know that coming into a job because first of all, it changes every week.
Yeah, and there's very good
And
documentation.
it's perfectly documented. If
Yeah.
you can't figure it out from the documentation, you should be working for us anyway.
Right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. Yeah, it's about finding smart people, really, when you get down to people who can solve good problems, you know. So.
Yeah, there's certainly interchangeable. If you've done something with an external API,
Right.
some other API, you can probably figure out
How to do somebody else's.
somebody else's.
Yep. Absolutely. And I mean, even honestly, even if you haven't, if you have somebody who's very skilled, who's developed SOAP APIs in the past, and you want to have them work with a RESTful system, they at least get, you know, how to do permissions. They get, you know, they know the basics, and they'll fill in the details if they're smart enough to do it. All right. So I also have to auction off a book. I don't really know how to do that in particular, so I'm just.
I'd like it. Tell us
You like the book?
Tell us what the book is first before people humiliate themselves.
It's a PHP book. It's called The Good Parts. So
Who has a good 1-minute story about hiring?
that works. Who here is hired and has an interesting story to tell about it?
Bryan hired me once.
That did. I knew you looked familiar to me. I kept looking at you. That'll work. You get the book. All right.
Nobody?
I can tell you how I got my job.
Okay. Sure. That works.
I'm with this startup, and the father of one of the founders is a colleague of my wife's. And for the past year, I've been sort of talking to them, providing them with some technical information, you know, how are we doing and what should we do next. And my wife kept hearing complaints from the dad about how they're struggling to find people.
Mhm.
My wife would say, you know, my husband can do that. And like every week he'd complain, my daughter's having this problem. She said, you know, my husband can do that. So in February, he finally just called his daughter and said, would you just hire the guy already? Because we both know that he can do this. And she said, someone keeps telling me he can do this.
That's funny.
So I got this phone call from the daughter, said, would you be interested in the job? I said, did your dad tell you to hire me? She said, yeah, but that's not the reason why we're gonna hire you.
All right. I like it.
Yeah, pure persistence.
Sometimes that's what you need. You need to kind of hammer at the door until somebody lets you in. So, all right. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for talking, for listening. Do you have any questions?